When you think of Christopher Columbus, what do you see? A brave sailor staring at the horizon from the deck of the Santa Maria, the man who discovered America, or the man who unleashed a wave of conquest, slavery, and genocide that changed the world forever. Tonight on Faces of History, we'll follow Columbus from the docks of Genoa to the courts of Spain, across uncharted seas to islands he could never truly name, and into the tangled legacy he left behind. I'm the Duke of New York. Stay curious, stay brave. Let's begin. Picture Genoa in the mid-15th century, a bustling port city clinging to the northern edge of the Mediterranean like a barnacle. Stone towers, tight alleys, the smell of salt and fish, wool and wine. This was no backwater village. This was one of Europe's maritime powerhouses. Ships from Africa, the Middle East, even distant ports like Bristol or Bruges bobbed in the harbor. Sailors swapped stories of lands beyond maps. Merchants haggled over barrels of spices and bolts of silk that had traveled farther than any Genoese fisherman ever would. In the middle of all this noise and trade, around 1451, a baby was born to a humble family, Cristoforo Colombo. His father, Domenico Colombo, wasn't a nobleman or a scholar. He was a wool weaver, a craftsman twisting coarse fleece into thread for the city's booming textile trade. He ran a small tavern on the side, anything to keep bread on the table. His mother, Susanna Fontana Rosa, worked alongside her husband, mending clothes, keeping house, raising their 5 children. Their house was not a palace. It was a simple stone dwelling above the shop, with a loom dominating the main room and the air always thick with wool fibers. The family was neither rich nor desperately poor, just one more set of hard-working hands in a city powered by ships and sweat. As a boy, Columbus learned to card wool before he could read. His fingers grew nimble on the loom, his mind shaped by the rhythms of labor. But the sea was never far away. Genoa's docks were his playground. He'd slip away from his chores to watch the tall ships unload their treasures: peppercorns from India, strange cloth from the East, stories of monsters, golden cities, distant islands with birds that glowed in the dark. Sometimes he'd stand barefoot at the edge of the harbor, squinting at the horizon where the sea blurred into sky. What lay beyond? How far could a sail carry you before you fell off the edge? The old sailors at the tavern told him tales of dragons and whirlpools, of the lands Marco Polo claimed to have seen: Cathay, Cipangu, the fabled islands of gold and silk. These stories lodged deep in young Cristoforo's mind. The loom began to feel like a prison. By his early teens, Columbus had learned basic Latin and arithmetic, enough to read charts, sign his name, keep a ledger. For a weaver's son, this was no small thing. Genoa's guilds and merchants valued literacy. Every bolt of wool, every barrel of saltfish required paperwork. But Columbus's eyes drifted back to the sea. By the time he was 14, he'd had enough of the loom's endless back and forth. He signed on as an apprentice deckhand on a merchant ship, the kind that carried olive oil, wine, and wool to ports across the Mediterranean. It was grueling work, hauling sails, scrubbing decks, dodging pirates who prowled the sea lanes between Portugal and North Africa. In 1476, fate nearly swallowed him whole. A convoy Columbus sailed with came under attack by French privateers off the coast of Portugal. Ships splintered under cannon fire, men leapt into the sea, some to drown, some to swim for shore. Columbus was one of the lucky ones, clinging to floating wreckage, paddling for hours through salt and blood, until the coast of Portugal rose out of the dawn like a promise. Shipwrecked but not defeated, Columbus dragged himself ashore near Lisbon. He was in his mid-20s now, seasoned by storms and scars. In Portugal, then the beating heart of Europe's age of exploration, Columbus found himself at the edge of the known world. Lisbon's docks teemed with sailors fresh from the African coast, Portuguese captains charting courses around the Cape Verde Islands and toward India's riches. For Columbus, Portugal was an education the loom could never give him. Here he learned from cartographers, read the journals of Prince Henry the Navigator's expeditions, copied maps by candlelight. He studied the winds and currents of the Atlantic, pored over the stories of Marco Polo and Ptolemy's ancient ideas of the world's shape. He married well. Filipa Moniz Perestrello, the daughter of a Portuguese nobleman and navigator. Through her family, Columbus gained access to precious maritime charts and insider knowledge of the Atlantic islands. Madeira, the Azores, stepping stones into the deep ocean. But he also suffered losses. Felipe died young, leaving Columbus with a son, Diego, and a fresh layer of grief to push him harder toward the horizon. Cristoforo Colombo, the weaver's son, was no longer content with the Mediterranean's safe routes. He dreamed bigger, not south, but west, into waters no European had dared sail beyond the familiar coasts. He believed the world was small enough to cross by heading the opposite way. The experts said he was wrong, dangerously wrong. But Columbus, stubborn as any weaver's child, refused to listen. He'd spend the next decade pushing that dream into the ears of kings and queens, chasing royal patrons, promising golden cities and converts for the cross. The weaver's son from Genoa was done spinning wool. He was ready to spin the world on its axis. So there he was, Cristoforo Colombo, marooned in Portugal, widowed young, a father with a child to raise, and a dream so vast it could swallow him whole. He spent his days at the docks, nights at the map tables. In Lisbon, he mingled with the men who made Europe's great age of exploration possible. Map makers, mathematicians, astrologers, ship captains hardened by African voyages and Atlantic storms. Portugal was alive with ambition in the 1470s. Prince Henry the Navigator had long since pushed Portuguese ships down the west coast of Africa. Gold trickled back to Lisbon. Slaves, too. And rumors of more gold if they could just round Africa's southern tip and open a direct sea lane to India's fabled spices. Most Portuguese captains were focused south and east, but Columbus looked west, stubbornly west. The idea wasn't original, but Columbus's conviction was. People today love to say that Columbus proved the world was round. That's a myth. Most educated people in the 15th century already knew the earth was round. They could see the curve of ships disappearing hull first over the horizon. What stopped them from sailing west was simple. They knew how big the earth really was. Columbus didn't. He dug through ancient books, Ptolemy, Marco Polo, Pierre d'Ailly. He studied maps that showed Asia stretching much farther east than it actually does. He clung to travelers' tales that exaggerated the size of Japan and shrank the size of the ocean. Columbus calculated and miscalculated until he convinced himself he could reach the riches of Cathay, China, and Cipangu, Japan, in just a few weeks' sail from Europe. If true, it would be the greatest shortcut in human history. But the experts, the real cartographers, astronomers, navigators, knew Columbus's numbers were fantasy. The Earth was far bigger than he guessed, by about a third. If there had been nothing but water between Europe and Asia, Columbus's fleet would have run out of food and water long before they ever reached land. The twist of fate was this. No one in Europe knew about the giant landmass blocking Columbus's path, the Americas. His mistake turned out to be the accident that would change the world. But first he needed ships, and ships needed gold, and gold meant kings. He tried Portugal first. In 1484, Columbus pitched his plan to King John II. Fund 3 ships, a crew of brave men, and he would sail due west and open a new trade route to the east. The Portuguese royal advisors studied Columbus's numbers, then politely laughed him out of Lisbon. They knew the distances were impossibly wrong. They thanked him, then quietly sent their own ships to test the Atlantic currents, just in case. Columbus packed up his maps, his toddler son Diego, and headed for Spain, beaten but not broken. Spain was freshly united under Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, the Catholic monarchs. Their marriage had stitched together Spain's 2 largest kingdoms. Now they were obsessed with driving out the last vestiges of Islamic rule. The Moors still held Granada in the south, and every royal coin and cannon was pointed there. Columbus found his way into the royal court, a foreigner with ragged clothes, a foreign accent, and eyes that burned with his impossible dream. He begged for an audience. He charmed monks and minor nobles, told tales of silks, spices, and souls ready to be converted. He promised them not just gold and cinnamon, but glory for Christendom. If they just give him the ships. Again, the royal advisors reviewed his pitch. Again, they found his math laughable. But Isabella was fascinated by this tall, red-haired foreigner with his wild eyes. She liked dreamers. Dreamers could make empires. And besides, she and Ferdinand had bigger problems, finishing the Reconquista and keeping up with Portugal's growing naval power. Columbus waited, sometimes months at a time, in dusty towns like Cordoba and Salamanca. He wrote letters, pestered priests, debated scholars who told him bluntly he was wrong. He lived on charity, mostly, while Diego was looked after by monks. At least twice, the royal council rejected him outright. But each time, Columbus clawed his way back, with new arguments, new patrons, new promises. Meanwhile, his demands grew larger, absurdly so. He didn't just want funding, he wanted titles. He asked to be named Admiral of the Ocean Sea. He wanted to be governor of any lands he found, with 10% of all profits. To his critics, he looked delusional. To Columbus, this was his destiny. In 1492, Ferdinand and Isabella finally took Granada, the last Muslim kingdom in Spain. Suddenly, they had time and money to gamble. The Portuguese were pushing farther east. If Columbus was right, Spain could leapfrog over Portugal's monopoly in a single stroke. They called him back. The deal was done. Columbus got his ships, 3 worn caravels, the Niña, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. He got his titles, he got his promise of riches, and he got the ocean, that vast, vast, dark frontier he'd been dreaming of since the loom. The plan was reckless. The plan was flawed. The plan was impossible, and it was about to change the world forever. So the plan was set. The papers signed in ink that would outlast every map Columbus carried. Titles that crowned him Admiral of the Ocean Sea, Viceroy and Governor of any lands he found, a tenth of all treasure, a new noble line, the House of Columbus, ready to be born from the salt spray of the Atlantic. But first he had to survive it. On August 3rd, 1492, 3 ships slipped from the port of Palos de la Frontera, the Niña, nimble, swift, the Pinta, quick and lightly built, her crew famously restless. The Santa Maria, the largest of the 3, lumbering and stout, Columbus's flagship. About 90 men sailed with him, sailors, carpenters, cooks, cabin boys, rough men, most of them. Many had signed on out of desperation. Some were criminals given the choice, jail or the sea. Few trusted Columbus's promise of Asia beyond the waves. Most believed the same stories their grandfathers whispered, that monsters waited out there, dragons that swallowed ships whole, whirlpools that pulled men down to a drowning black. But Columbus promised gold. Gold for Spain, gold for them. And so they sailed. Here, Columbus made final repairs. He stocked up on fresh water, salted meat, hard biscuits crawling with weevils, barrels of wine already souring in the sun. He read the winds. He read the stars. Then he pointed the bowsprits west into a sea no European had crossed deliberately and returned to tell about it. The Atlantic in September is a living thing. Winds that twist without warning, waves that climb mountains high. Columbus knew the winds from the Portuguese charts. The trade winds would push them west. He didn't tell the crew how far he guessed they'd have to go. His own notes hid the true distances. He lied about how many leagues they sailed each day, underreporting the numbers to calm mutinous whispers. If they thought they hadn't gone too far, they'd believe they could turn back. Nights brought arguments and prayers. Salt sores festered. The food spoiled faster than planned. Water turned brackish and rank. The ships creaked like old bones. Sailors stared at the endless blue and whispered about turning back or throwing the mad Genoese overboard and sailing for Portugal. Then came signs. Drifting weeds, carved sticks, birds wheeling overhead. Columbus clung to these like holy relics. On October 11th, the men sighted a branch heavy with berries drifting past the bows. Birds not known to sleep on open water circled the rigging. Land must be near, or so Columbus promised. By that night, the Pinta's lookout, Rodrigo de Triana, shouted from the crow's nest, "Tierra! Tierra! Land! Land!" They had done it, stumbled onto the threshold of a world Columbus never knew he was about to change forever. The sun rose on October 12, 1492, over white beaches and swaying palms, a world the Taíno people had known for centuries, but which Columbus claimed in an instant. He stepped ashore wearing velvet and a plumed hat. Behind him, the standard of Castilla and Aragon flapped in the wind. He knelt, he prayed. He named the island San Salvador, Holy Savior, though its true name, given by its people, was Guanahani. He offered gifts, glass beads, red caps, tiny bells. The Taíno offered food, fresh water, curiosity. They were gentle, welcoming, and Columbus wrote in his log that they would make fine servants, easy to rule, easy to convert. He noted they wore gold ornaments through their noses, gold the lure that had dragged him across an ocean. He sailed on, Convinced Cipangu, Marco Polo's fabled Japan lay just beyond the next island. He found Cuba, thought it might be Cathay. He found Hispaniola, larger, rich with trees and rivers. Here, he left men behind to build the first European settlement in the Americas, La Navidad. He traded, demanded tribute, made promises he could never keep. The crew's discipline frayed, greed and disease followed. Spanish iron clashed with wooden spears. Columbus barely kept order with threats and punishments, both for the natives and for his own men. When the Santa Maria ran aground off Hispaniola, Columbus had no choice but to cram the survivors onto the Niña and Pinta. With proof in hand, native captives, gold trinkets, colorful parrots, he turned east for Spain. On March 15th, 1493, Columbus limped into Palos with 2 battered ships and a story that would shatter Europe's maps forever. The docks erupted, bells rang out. The ragged admiral of the ocean sea paraded through Spanish towns showing off the trophies. Bright feathers, bewildered Taíno captives, tiny flecks of gold. He told Ferdinand and Isabella that he'd found the outer edges of Asia. He promised more gold, more spices, more souls for the church. Spain believed him, wanted to believe him. Portugal seethed, other monarchs took notice. And Columbus? He was already dreaming of the next voyage. He hadn't found Cebu, but surely it lay just a few more leagues west. 4 voyages in all, each more desperate than the last. Columbus would cross the Atlantic again and again, sailing into hurricanes, uprisings, shipwrecks. He never found Asia, never realized he'd stumbled onto continents unknown to Europeans. He saw islands, Hispaniola, Cuba, Jamaica, but never mainland North America. Every voyage pulled him deeper into conflict, with native peoples, with his own crew, with Spanish settlers who hated his rule. Gold was scarce, rebellion common, disease constant. The paradise he'd promised turned to betrayal and blood. But that first crossing, those 33 days on the Atlantic, opened a door that could never be closed. Millions would pass through it. Conquistadors with steel and gunpowder, priests with crosses and confessionals, settlers with plows and fences. The Atlantic would become a highway for ships, for trade, for dreams, for disease and death. It all began with 3 ships, 90 men, and a weaver's son staring into a horizon he didn't fully understand. When Columbus and his weary crew stepped onto those white beaches in October 1492, they believed, or at least Columbus insisted, they'd landed on the edges of Asia. Cipangu, Cathay, the lands Marco Polo had filled with gold-roofed palaces and silken robes. But what they found was something else entirely. Sun-drenched islands, thick jungles, parrots bright as gems, and people, the Taíno, the Arawak, the gentle faces behind the word Indios, the name Columbus used because he was sure he was standing in the Indies. At first, it was all ceremony and curiosity. Columbus came ashore draped in velvet, clutching the royal standard of Castile and Aragon. He claimed the land for Spain, land that already belonged to those who stood barefoot before him, offering fruit, parrots, cotton thread, and wide smiles. They marveled at his ships, his bearded men, his iron weapons. They touched the sailors' pale skin and the shine of their swords. They traded what they had, beads, food, feathers, tiny bits of gold. Columbus recorded it all with a merchant's eye. They do not bear arms. They should be good and intelligent servants. They could easily be made Christians. To him, this was opportunity. New subjects for the crown, new souls for the church, new hands to dig for gold he was certain lay buried just out of sight. But these Indios were not the docile innocents Columbus liked to describe in his letters home. The Taíno lived in sophisticated villages. They farmed cassava, sweet potatoes, maize. They fished with woven nets, paddled sleek canoes far larger than the Spanish boats. They had leaders, caciques, who commanded respect and tribute. At first, the Taíno welcomed these strange visitors. They traded willingly, shared food and shelter they had no reason to fear, yet. Columbus's first outpost, La Navidad, was built from the wreckage of the Santa Maria. He left behind 40 men under the command of Diego de Arana to gather gold, convert the locals, and hold the beachhead until he returned with more ships and supplies. Columbus promised they'd be safe, that the Taíno would feed and protect them. But Columbus underestimated the world he'd stumbled into. The Taíno were not alone in the Caribbean. To the east and south were the Caribs, feared raiders who sometimes attacked Taíno villages, who practiced ritual warfare and, according to the Spanish, cannibalism. The line between myth and truth blurred quickly in these early accounts, but real conflict was certain. The men Columbus left behind didn't keep the fragile peace. They fought over women, gold, food. They raided Taíno villages. They demanded tribute. And when Columbus returned on his second voyage, he found La Navidad burned to the ground, his men dead, killed by the very people he described as gentle and easily ruled. His second voyage brought more than ships. It brought conquest. This time, Columbus did not arrive with 3 battered caravels. He sailed back with 17 ships, over 1,000 settlers, soldiers, priests, and enough iron and powder to plant a European flag firmly in Caribbean soil. The dream of trade and gentle conversion gave way to brute force. The Spanish built new settlements, demanded gold that didn't exist in the rivers and hills as Columbus had promised. When the Taíno didn't deliver, Columbus ordered their villages burned, their leaders captured, their people branded as tribute bearers. The tribute system was simple and savage. Each adult Taíno was forced to deliver a certain weight of gold every few months. If they didn't, they faced punishment, whippings, mutilation, death. When the gold ran dry, because there was never enough to begin with, the Spanish demanded labor instead: food crops, cotton, bodies to carry loads for their new masters. Disease came too: smallpox, measles, influenza, European sicknesses the islanders' immune systems had never encountered. Whole villages fell silent overnight, their dead buried in shallow graves, or left to rot in jungles now echoing with the songs of birds and the silence of vanished families. Not everyone accepted this without resistance. Taíno leaders like Caonabo, a fierce cacique on Hispaniola, led uprisings. He fought to defend his people from the settlers' cruelty. He and other warriors burned forts, killed Spanish soldiers in surprise attacks, but the Spanish had steel swords, crossbows, war dogs, horses, and the crown's blessing to crush rebellion. Captured, tortured, and shackled in iron, Caonabo was shipped to Spain as a trophy, but died in chains at sea, never seeing the land his captors called home. Columbus wrote back to Ferdinand and Isabella, spinning the violence as progress. He promised endless wealth as long as he could subdue the savages. He begged for more men, more ships, more supplies. He painted himself as a noble crusader, explorer, governor, bringer of the faith. Behind him, the islands bled. Within a few decades, the Taíno population, estimated to be hundreds of thousands, plummeted to near extinction. Disease, forced labor, rebellion, and despair erased entire villages from the maps Columbus had so proudly drawn. The admiral's dream of golden kingdoms faded. No gold-laden temples rose out of the jungle. No Sipangu appeared on the horizon. Instead, Columbus found himself governing a brutal experiment in colonization and struggling to control both the land and the men he'd brought to tame it. The Indios, he called childlike and passive, proved they were anything but. They were people with their own world, now caught in the jaws of an empire that never asked permission to exist. His first encounters were not gentle exchanges of beads for spices. They were the first sparks of a fire that would consume continents. Like arc. For most people, Columbus's story stops with the 3 ships and the shore. But the truth is, the man who sailed west to find Asia did not sail home to parades and triumph forever. Instead, his last years were storms of betrayal, blood, broken promises. A man who once pointed his finger at the horizon now spent his days defending himself in royal courts, shackled by the same dreams that first set him free. The second voyage, 17 ships, more than 1,000 men, cracked open the Caribbean like a ripe fruit. Hispaniola, the jewel of Columbus's New World, turned sour almost overnight. He built forts and towns, Isabella, the first European city in the Americas, but it rotted in the humidity and disease. Crops failed, food spoiled, soldiers brawled with settlers raided villages for gold and women. The Taíno rose up in revolt. Columbus struck them down with iron and terror. His promises to Ferdinand and Isabella, rivers of gold, souls for the church, evaporated in Hispaniola's forests. The gold deposits were shallow, hard to find, never enough to satisfy the crown's greed or Columbus's endless boasts. So he improvised, forced labor, tribute, slave shipments. When gold failed, Columbus packed the holds of Spanish ships with human cargo, hundreds of Taíno chained and branded. Many died before they reached Spain. Those who survived were sold in Seville's markets like cattle. Even Queen Isabella, the monarch who had gambled on Columbus when no one else would, recoiled at the sight of enslaved converts and ordered some freed and returned. Meanwhile, Columbus's grip on his own people slipped. His brothers, Bartolomeo and Diego, ruled alongside him, not as wise governors but as petty tyrants. The settlers mutinied. Priests sent letters home detailing cruelty and corruption. Spanish colonists complained of Columbus's paranoia, that he handed down whippings, cut off noses and ears, hanged men for petty theft, locked them in iron chains under the tropical sun. He fought rebellions with brute force, native and Spanish alike. To the crown back in Castile, the New World was supposed to be an orchard of endless profit, but under Columbus it became an unruly experiment soaked in blood and scandal. Rumors grew back in Spain. The monarch sent Francisco de Bobadilla, a royal investigator with authority to look into the Admiral of the Ocean Sea. When Bobadilla arrived in Hispaniola in 1500, he found Spanish settlers shackled, streets littered with unburied corpses, starving colonists who cursed Columbus's name. Bobadilla did not wait for pleasantries. He arrested Columbus and his brothers. The man who once sailed triumphant into Palos returned to Spain not on a royal throne but in chains, iron biting into wrists that once clutched the royal standard in San Salvador's sand. It was a humiliation Columbus never forgave. He wore the shackles for days, even when offered freedom. He demanded the chains remain on until he could plead his case before Ferdinand and Isabella, proof, he said, of how unjustly he'd been treated. In court, the crown half believed him. After all, he'd cracked the Atlantic open for Spain. They freed him, restored some dignity, but not his titles. He would never again govern Hispaniola. His dream of ruling vast kingdoms like a feudal lord was dust. Still, Columbus was not finished. One final voyage, his fourth, left Spain in 1502. By then, he was older, weakened by arthritis and years of tropical fevers. He sailed along the coasts of what we now call Honduras and Panama, convinced to the bitter end that he was skirting the back door of Asia. He fought hurricanes that smashed his ships to driftwood. He lost 2 caravels to reefs off Jamaica's coast and stranded himself and his crew for a year, begging local people for food while pirates and storms cut off rescue. One story sums up this last desperate chapter. Marooned in Jamaica, Columbus used an almanac to predict a lunar eclipse. He told the local chiefs that his Christian God would blot out the moon if they did not feed his starving men. When the moon turned red, they relented, and Columbus got one last cargo of cassava and fish for the return journey. In November 1504, Columbus returned to Spain for the final time, broken, sick, and nearly blind. He haunted the royal court for 2 more years, pleading with Ferdinand for the riches and titles he'd been promised. He argued that all he had done, the bloodshed, the slavery, the lost lives, was for God and Spain. But the tide had turned. By now, new explorers were charting the true scope of the lands Columbus had stumbled upon. Amerigo Vespucci's letters would soon put a new name on the maps: America, not Asia. New governors replaced the Genoese admiral. The world was moving on without him. On May 20th, 1506, in a modest house in Valladolid, Columbus died, 55 years old. Arthritis had twisted his bones. Malaria and tropical fevers had ravaged his body. He died convinced to the end that he had found Asia, never fully grasping that he'd stumbled onto 2 continents unknown to his world. His heirs fought for decades to claim the riches he believed were owed to him. Lawsuits and counterclaims that dragged through Spanish courts for generations. The man who had crossed an ocean chasing gold and glory died half forgotten. But the world he collided with would never be the same. A sailor's dream, a king's gamble, an ocean's secrets. All of it cracked open by a weaver's son who never knew exactly where he was, but knew with a stubborn fire that he'd found something worth changing everything for. When Christopher Columbus died in that modest house in Valladolid in 1506, he left behind more than unpaid debts, grieving sons, and a tangle of broken promises. He left behind a legend and a curse that would ripple across oceans, centuries, and continents. He died still dreaming of Asia, still convinced the islands and coasts he'd stumbled across were the edges of the Orient described by Marco Polo. He never grasped that he had collided with a continent unknown to his Europe. He went to his grave clutching titles he believed should make his family lords over empires. but the world he helped set in motion had already slipped from his grasp. In the years after his death, the story of Columbus became something bigger than the man himself. It became a banner, a myth, a convenient seed for kings, priests, and settlers to plant in new soil. The Spanish crown sent conquistadors farther inland, Cortés into Mexico, Pizarro into Peru. Gold that Columbus never found poured out of mines in Mexico and the Andes, filling the treasuries of Madrid. The Catholic Church spread its mission like wildfire. Crosses and cannons arrived together. Columbus's heirs, his sons Diego and Ferdinand, fought bitter legal battles for decades to hold on to the rights and wealth their father claimed. They won small victories in Spanish courts, chunks of land, minor titles, but the crown had learned its lesson. No single man would ever again have so much power over Spain's New World. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the world Columbus had stumbled upon was unraveling. The Taíno, the first faces Columbus wrote about in his journals, gentle, naked, innocent, were all but gone by the mid-1500s. Smallpox, forced labor, starvation, and outright slaughter erased entire villages. Some fled deep into the forests. Some resisted. Most vanished from the pages of European chronicles, a people lost to silence. Other empires rose on the bones of those first encounters. The Columbian Exchange, goods, plants, animals, diseases, flowed both ways. Europe sent horses, pigs, wheat, and iron. The Americas gave back corn, potatoes, tomatoes, tobacco, and the human tide followed. Millions of Europeans came west. Millions of Africans were dragged here in chains. Columbus became a symbol, but what that symbol meant kept changing. In Spain, for centuries, he was the daring navigator, the admiral of the ocean sea. His voyages were proof of Spain's divine destiny, a Catholic empire stretching across oceans. In Italy, he became a folk hero too, the stubborn Genoese sailor who showed what an Italian spirit could do. In the Americas themselves, he was less a hero than a ghost, the opening act of conquest. By the 18th and 19th centuries, revolutionaries in the New World, from Mexico to the United States, sometimes invoked Columbus as a symbol of new beginnings, a European who broke the chains of old kingdoms and crossed the sea into possibility. In the newly formed United States, Columbus became something strange, a secular saint of discovery. Italian immigrants, mocked and marginalized, found pride in him. Cities named streets and parks in his honor. By the late 19th century, as the country looked for unifying myths, Columbus was polished into the smiling sailor who discovered America. Never mind that he never set foot on the mainland that would become the United States. Never mind the blood that soaked those beaches. The myth was more convenient than the truth. But history has a long memory and a shorter patience for illusions. In the 20th century, cracks formed in the heroic statue. Scholars revisited the letters, the forced labor, the dismemberments, the slave ships. Indigenous voices rose louder, telling the other side of the story, that Columbus didn't discover a new world but invaded an old one, leaving scars that never fully healed. Monuments built to celebrate him have become lightning rods for protest and anger. Cities debate whether his name deserves parades or plaques at all. In some places, Columbus Day has given way to Indigenous Peoples Day, a shift from glorifying the sailor to honoring those whose worlds he upended.
So which Columbus is real?
The daring sailor who opened the ocean and connected two hemispheres for the first time in human history? Or the brutal governor who launched a wave of conquest, slavery, and genocide that reshaped entire continents? The truth is, he is both, and neither. The real Columbus is the stubborn weaver's son, who turned stories and guesswork into sails and ships, who believed in a shortcut to Asia so completely he crossed an ocean no European had dared to cross. He is the dreamer who miscalculated distances and stumbled onto a truth bigger than any map. He is also the tyrant, the ruthless governor who chained people he called innocent, who unleashed a hunger for gold that devoured cultures whole. 500 years later, we stand in the wake of that collision, with all its glory, horror, and contradiction. We eat potatoes from Peru and tomatoes from Mesoamerica. We speak languages spread by ships and crosses. We live on lands renamed by kings and dreamers who never asked who was already here. This is the tangled legacy of Christopher Columbus, part myth, part monster, part man, woven together like the wool his father once spun in a Genoese workshop. And whether we honor him, curse him, or quietly remove his statues, we cannot erase him because he is not just a man, he is a turning point, a horizon crossed that could never be uncrossed. I'm the Duke of New York, and this has been Faces of History. Stay curious, stay brave, and when you look at a map tonight, remember, sometimes the edge of the known world is only the beginning of the story.